We're going to talk about abolitionists and the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists, so quick definition of an abolitionist. An abolitionist is a someone who would like to abolish or get rid of slavery. Okay? By 1804 in the United States of America, most states in the North had abolished or gotten rid of slavery. That's what an abolitionist is. There's someone who fights to get rid of slavery. In 1807, U.S. slave trade was abolished. That means international slave trade, more slaves being brought from Africa. Okay, the slaves, people who were born into slavery became slaves. That's what you need to understand here, folks. Okay? The North wants to end slavery. The North, most people are either one of two things. They're farmers or they work in a factory. The North has an industrial economy. That means they build what they're doing out of making things in factories or farming. The South is reliant heavily on farming and agriculture. Okay, so who's doing all the work in the South? Slaves. Okay. Some of your abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, the Grimke sisters, John Quincy Adams. Okay. Joshua Giddings, Jefferson, Ohio, out in Ashtabula County, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and John Brown. We're going to talk about them today, okay? First, get into is John Brown, okay? John Brown was a polarizing figure. In the North, he's considered a saint. He's a saint to slaves. In the South, he is a madman, a treasonous madman. Okay? So, what John Brown does, he's an abolitionist, and he plans an armed revolt to end slavery. Okay? He is going to be in Kansas, where he's going to lead revolts against, and they're going to kill Southerners who migrate into the new territory. Okay? He attempts to arm slaves on multiple occasions. And in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, he incites a slave rebellion where they raid a arsenal, which is where we keep our weapons. We still have arsenals today. Arsenals is where you put all your basically your arms, your tanks. There can be planes on there could be cannons, there can be guns, whatever it is, whatever the weapons are, they have them. They raided one. John Brown, accompanied by slaves, raids a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Okay, he's captured and he's hanged. Now look at some of the images of John Brown. There's John Brown. There you go. There's a artist depiction of John Brown. Here's more artist depiction of John Brown. First off, you'd think he's bigger than Shaquille O'Neal in the left one, this one, and a complete maniac. And then this one, the guy looks like a saint, kissing a baby, right? Right? He's executed, and he is one of the big abolitionists in this Southern movement to abolish slavery. Okay, he did it by taking over a federal arsenal in Virginia, where he is eventually executed for his crimes, and they actually killed the slaves who were in the revolt. Okay, all right. William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist, a journalist. Okay, he publishes a newspaper called The Liberator. Okay, he wants to all the writings pertain to the evils of slavery, the ill-gotten wealth of the South, right? Because how are they making money in the South? Well, they're making it off the labor of slaves, okay, with cotton, with tobacco, with indigo, with rice, with their regular crops, right, feeding everybody on the plantation, feeding everybody in the South. Well, they're doing that with slave labor. And that is basically the basis for William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, and his newspaper. Then you got the Grimke sisters, okay, Sir and Angelina. Grimke sisters were born in the South in a slave-holding family. Okay? Their thing is they figured out, like, okay, most people don't understand that why people are racist. People don't understand why people are hateful. Well, when you're born into a hateful, racist environment, how are you going to know any better? How are you going to understand? Like, I just can't understand how those people could be like that. Well, if they don't know anything else, and they're never educated and they don't talk to other people, they're not going to know that. Grimke sisters figured out pretty quickly that it was a toxic environment to hold and own slaves. Okay, their lives were focused on not just racial equality but gender equality for men and women. Okay, then we go to Theodore Weld. He led a petition against slavery in the South. Also a author, a public speaker against slavery. Now, I want you to think about this, folks. The Grimke sisters and Theodore Weld. Do you think they were very welcomed in the South? What do you think? Right? You know, he writes a book, Slavery as It Is, The Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses, published in 1839. Do you think that book was legal in the South? Do you think that they wanted to see people owning that text in the South? No. So these people are going to put their lives on the line. They're going to have to be in the North and live in the North. They're not welcome in the South, and to the point where there'd be death threats. You couldn't live there. Okay, if they found you or caught you, they would execute you publicly. They would essentially lynch abolitionists if they caught them. John Quincy Adams, as you know, President of the United States. He actually defends slaves in a court case, right? Because he defends the slaves of the ship the Amistad, where they went and had a mutiny. Also, Joshua Giddings, okay? They created petitions to end slavery. They said if you get rid of these books, right? If you get rid of the author's writings, okay? You're violating the First Amendment. That's censorship, folks. Okay? If you can't, read the writings of Theodore Weld, right? Effectively, what you're doing is you're censoring people. Do you think the United States of America is big on censorship? Or are we all about free speech? I want you to think about that. Because we're in a really crazy time right now where you have YouTube, and YouTube's allowed to remove videos. Facebook's allowed to remove content, right? Well, they're allowed to do it because they're a private platform. Okay? The government doesn't own those platforms. Those are private companies that own the platform. So they're allowed to remove your information. John Quincy Adams is going to defend the slaves who kill their slave owners and slave traders. Well, they were slave traders, slavers, if you will. And it's a mutiny. Okay? Obviously, super violent movie if you ever watch it. Violent book. All right? And he does a pretty good job. The slaves are found not guilty. Okay? So when you look at this stuff, it's big. It's big that slaves can be defended by a lawyer like John Quincy Adams, obviously President of the United States as well. Frederick Douglass. Now, folks, Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave. He is an author. He is probably, for all intents and purposes, one of the lead abolitionists and most famous abolitionists that there was. He was an orator, public speaker, okay? Equal rights for all, okay? He escaped from the South to the North where he became a free man, okay? He shared his experiences with people, okay? Taught himself how to read and write. Obviously, he's an author. He wrote the narrative of a life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, in 1845. Once again, would that text be sold in the South? No. They don't want people to point out how bad the institution of slavery is, okay? Sojourner Truth, right? She was also a impressive orator, public speaker, okay? Fighting for women's rights and slaves' rights, okay? She gives her Ain't I a Woman speech, famous speech in Ohio, in Akron at a convention for free and equal rights for women. And she's also vehemently against the slavery movement, okay? Along with Sojourner Truth, you're going to have another really super strong abolitionist and former slave, and Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is going to be probably what we're going to see here with the $20 bill coming up is Harriet Tubman is going to replace, she's going to replace Andrew Jackson, okay? And your $20 bill, this is who's going to be on it. And she is one of your greatest conductors on the Underground Railroad. Now, folks, was the Underground Railroad physically, did it have tracks and railroad ties and did trains run on it? No. It's a series of escape routes, okay? And whether it's people's homes, the cellars of people's homes, caves, okay, places that they built in the woods. Okay, the conductors were people who were operating in the dark at night and moving escaped slaves from the south to the north. Okay, freedom was in the north. Ultimately, if you really wanted to gain your ultimate freedom, you had to go into Canada. Because what happens is we're going to talk about this Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, this Fugitive Slave Act is going to require Northerners to capture and return slaves to their Southern owners. Obviously, a lot of Northerners are going to ignore it, but they're subject to punishment by the fullest extent of the law if they do ignore it, okay? So there's actually stations around Riverside, actually. It's crazy, where people could stop and hide in order to then go to the next step in the Underground Railroad to try and get to Canada, okay? Harriet Tubman made 19 round trips to the South, helping to save over 300 slaves. She was shot, stabbed, attacked by dogs. You name it, Harriet Tubman endured it. So, one of the toughest humans probably in American history, Harriet Tubman, and a great example of how, this is the American spirit too, folks. She's defying something that's wrong in slavery. Maybe it was legal then, but it was still wrong. Okay, and Harriet Tubman is the shining example and an abolitionist who wanted to end slavery and probably the greatest Underground Railroad conductor there ever was. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Okay, so what she's going to do, she's going to write a text that's going to be banned text in the South. It's going to be Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book tells about the terrible conditions of slavery and a horrible murder at the end of it. Okay, Tom is beaten to death at the end. Okay? This was the type of stuff that inspired Abraham Lincoln. She's the daughter of a preacher. Okay? Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, once again, polarizing book. To read it in the North, it only confirms the brutality of slavery in the South. To read it in the South, it is an attack on your way of life and how you've always lived, and the only thing you've ever known is people owning other people. Okay? So we have a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville. He observed that the inherent unequal treatment of slaves of African descent in America. How Americans have this, like, quote-unquote American dream unless you're of African descent and a slave. Okay? And they're deprived of the privileges of humanity. Okay? And that is what he basically writes about it. They called it the peculiar institution of slavery. Well, obviously, we know it's inherently a flawed institution where only the slave owners benefit from it, and the terrorization of generations and generations of slaves of African descent, murder, treated as property. The whole thing is so wild that people couldn't see this. Once again, when you're born into it and raised into it, how would you know? Till people from the outside are telling you and influencing you. Underground Railroad, okay, as I said, it's a series of escape routes from the south to the north. Obviously, the greatest conductor, one of the greatest conductors, Harriet Tubman. She made multiple round trips, shot, stabbed, attacked by dogs, you name it. Stations were people's homes. They could be spots in the woods. Somebody could dig a hole in the woods and throw branches over it. That could be considered a stop or a station, right? Normally it was where you could get more food, shelter, warmth. That's normally what stations were, but they made caves out of shelter. You name it, they tried to make a shelter out of it, okay? This is some of the routes that were traveled. Now, if you look at Georgia and Florida, obviously they would have to escape by boat. If you look at Charleston, South Carolina, once again by boat. And the other ones were overland, right? And if you look right here you guys are, right? just east of Cleveland. There would be routes right up through Toledo to Detroit, and then over the Detroit River into Windsor, across the Great Lakes. All these different routes that you look at. This was the Underground Railroad. Once again, not a physical railroad, folks. Not a physical railroad, but a series of routes, passages, and people's homes where they would give safe passage and shelter to slaves trying to escape to Canada in the north. And if you want to see what the Underground Railroad looked like in Ohio, this is what it looked like. You can probably get a better image of that if you Google it. And if you look in Old Lake County up here, you had some routes that went to the lake and they went over the lake on boat into Ontario, Canada, current day Ontario, Canada. All right, once again, abolitionists. This is going to be a wedge in between America, and we're going to start to come into Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott decision, all these different things that are going to further lead to the start of the Civil War next week in class, and will be Civil War the next 2 weeks with the start of it next week. Questions? The quiz will be posted later today. It will be Underground Railroad, abolitionists, and California Gold Rush. All right, folks, there you go.